definitely looking forward to spending this hour with you talking about environmental and climate justice. And yeah, I don't know. Let's see. Maybe if people wouldn't mind putting in the chat just kind of your name and where you're from, and any other little things you might want to share for the good of the group. That would be great. So we can start to build some community together, even though we're only going to be a community for an hour. But any way we can get it. Great. So welcome, Laura, Jubilee community. That sounds awesome. So definitely looking forward to having this discussion with you all. So I think what we're going to do is start with a few slides just to really kind of ground us in some of the understanding of what I've been asked to talk about, which is really the intersection between environmental racism and environmental and climate justice. Um, so yeah, hopefully it will be a stimulating conversation for everyone. And then in the end, we really do want to end with some action steps that everyone will be able to take. We'll kind of talk about, yeah, what we're called to do arising from this conversation. So um, I will share my screen so you can see some images as I talk, and then like I said, we'll come back together and have some discussion together. So here we go. All right. And windows, I have way too many windows open. This is always my issue. And here it is. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So we are going from current slide. And the good thing about this is that there is the closed caption. I'm kind of a serial fast talker, mostly because I'm an introvert. So I'm always trying to get finished as quickly as possible so I can just stop talking altogether. But so I'm going to try to go a little bit slower because that's always a challenge with speaking with people for whom English isn't the first language and so forth. So one of the things we want to always model in doing this work is accommodating anyone and everyone who is in the room. So I'm glad to see that the closed caption will somewhat help with that moderation. So actually, I forgot that we do have this video as the opening piece. So one of the principles that we employ when we're advancing environmental and climate justice work is what they call the HEMES principles. And one of the principles of HEMES, which is, they call it the HEMES principles of democratic organizing. Like, how do we really organize with frontline leadership at the center of what we do? So one of the principles is let the people speak for themselves. So I like to use video because there's a video that's created by one of the communities that we are working with to advance this justice, and so we want to let that community tell their own story, and we really talk about what the implications are for the bigger picture. So let me show this, and I think I'm gonna have to stop sharing because you're probably not seeing. That's the thing about the screen share, because it's only you share it per program versus. Anyway, so here we are. Hopefully, let me know if you can hear. Okay, thanks.
The city of Baytown is made of old money, lower to middle class families, and pollution. But if you get a job at a chemical plant, you don't have time to think of a solution. I guess my brother, my uncle, and my cousins are sellouts because they went industrial instead of the drug route. Refinery city lights and pipes run along the Gulf Coast. The smoke boasts with sulfur air. It's a wonder anyone's able to take a breath. We're so used to it, we forget. Soon, the sons and daughters won't be able to drink the water. They say the first priority is the people. If the people are the ones being excluded and uprooted, just ask Archicorns, ask George Washington Carver Elementary, or ask the suburbanites. Exxon Sacrifice, AKA Brownwood Neighborhood. God bless social media, but Flint ain't the only case of complexion without protection. Baytown, AKA Dirty Bay, is surrounded by giant toxins, threatening the city in every way. We see the huge still from our window sills, make jokes as we choke. We've been possibly dying from this kind of poison oak. It's no mystery that the Black and brown communities are being targeted. Black Lives Matter, but not when they're expendable and making money is good for the market. Give them a fine, it's fine. They can afford it. We live with the headaches, the shortness of breath, and watery eyes. They keep building, we pay for it. Constantly trying to heal ourselves and repel the environmental destruction. Breathe it in. And breathe out.
Yeah, so that was Baytown, Texas, where if I don't stop it, then it's going to start playing the next video. We won't, and then they'll start talking over me. So this, the Baytown, Texas. Oops, sorry. Yep, there we go.
The environmental justice movement was founded, and most of its principles out of.
Okay, there we go. So Baytown, Texas is not only in this petrochemical corridor, but it is also an area that was inundated by Hurricane Harvey and gets inundated by all of these disasters that come through, because it's in the Gulf of Mexico there, which is why it's in this petrochemical corridor, because they build up around these waterways and coastal areas. So I will continue on from there and talk a little bit more about context. So when we talk about the historical context around environmental racism, it starts, you know, and we talk about environmental racism in the United States, it starts from it starts really not even, it predates the transatlantic slave trade, and really goes back to when the United States first became the United States, when it was when folks came over from European nations, and you know, really it starts with things like the Trail of Tears and the ways that colonization really happened here, and the ways that extractive exploitation, domination really drove the establishment of this country, and was furthered by actions like the transatlantic slave trade, and then the way we handle natural resources, and the way we aren't caring for creation, and then how we see how this becomes institutionalized with who's elected, what interests are being represented by who's elected, and the different policies that support an extractive, exploitive system that really thrives on dominion over certain marginalized populations, and dominion over the earth in a way that was never intended. So there's a quote from Martin Luther King: "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few." And that is where we find ourselves in terms of our economic context here in the United States. And so we see the drivers of the disparities and the disproportionate impacts of environmental degradation. So first and foremost, the disproportionate impact is borne by the earth and then its inhabitants. And we see how racism and xenophobia, the economic status, and then we see some of the tools of institutionalizing these disparities, including redlining, gentrification and displacement, corporatocracy and privatization, the way that poverty is actually criminalized, and the way we don't have the types of regulations and policies to constrain these challenges. Another quote from Martin Luther King is that laws cannot create heart, they can only constrain the heartless. And that is exactly what we've got kind of going on, and hopefully we're seeing a new day. And so we see the folks who do suffer the greatest from these institutionalized exploitive practices. So whether it's BIPOC populations, which for folks who aren't familiar with that term stands for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color populations, children, incarcerated persons, gig economy workers. And we see how not only are these same populations disproportionately impacted by climate and environmental degradation and its impacts, but also by things like COVID-19 and the resulting economic crisis. And so this is why when COVID-19 first was dawning on March the 10th, when it was still kind of isolated to this nursing home and in Washington State and so forth, we wrote this on March the 10th, this 10 equity implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. And because we saw, like, we knew what happened with climate, we knew what happened with Hurricane Katrina, we know what's happening with climate change and its impact, we know what's happened with many of the environmental crises. And so we could predict, like this pandemic, just like any other disaster, what lines it's going to follow on. And so these were the populations that we listed out in that document. And I'll share with you the link to that document if you haven't already seen it. And at that time, people thought, oh, do you really think this is all going to happen? Or they thought, and then afterwards, people thought it was prophetic, but it was really just, reading the lines and having had the experiences from these other kind of societal conditions and what it reads. So as we talk about, the NAACP, we put out a series of reports kind of chronicling the disproportionate impact of these environmental practices on our community. So cold-blooded, putting profits before people. We looked at coal-fired power plants throughout the country and ranked them based on the amount of pollution they put out, but also who lives around them. So the ones that had the most people around them, the most people of color, and the most in the way of low-income communities. And we gave them an environmental justice score based on that. So whether it's the communities that are, yes.
I apologize. We do have a hand raised from Carol.
Okay, I thought she was adjusting her. Sorry. Oh, let me. Okay, yes, Carol, do you want to chime in? Oops, she went off mute and then went back on.
There we go. At the beginning, you mentioned that you talked fairly rapidly. I have that exact same problem, so I really sympathize. But given that there's a lot on the screen, if you're talking rapidly and there's a lot on the screen, it's very hard to take notes. I don't know if you could slow it down a little or not. Like I said, I know how hard it is, so I really do empathize.
Yes, no, definitely I can slow down for sure. And we can make sure that everyone actually gets a copy of this presentation. It's not like, yeah.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, definitely. I'll put it online and then just send a link and you can have it because it's
great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So yeah, so whether it's the communities that are impacted or the frontline workers like the folks in the coal industry, we know that 76,000 coal miners have died of Black lung disease since 1968. And we also know that the very employers that are member organizations to the National Mining Association that lobby against the regulations for coal mine dust that would have actually protected the workers from the coal mine dust. And so they literally are more concerned about their profits than being concerned about their people. And 76,000 people and counting have lost their lives as a result. This is a community in the Four Corners region out west. And this is a Navajo family living on Navajo lands, and the coal mine behind, the coal plant behind them was one of 4 coal plants within a 30-mile radius of where they live. That one, I think, is one of the ones that is actually closed. So there's been progress since then, but unfortunately, so too many people still live in similar conditions where they're choking down the fumes from this coal plant. The person in that picture died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They point to the woman who's wearing the blue shirt there, and how she's pregnant. And we know that endocrine disruptors are one of the toxins that come out of these coal plants. And they also point to the 2 coolers on their porch, because even though there's 4 coal-fired power plants nearby, the coal plants are generating energy that go to Las Vegas and Phoenix. And while they, like many of the folks, like 70% of the people in that reservation or on those Navajo lands, do not have electricity or running water. So these are the types of deep inequities where it's pure exploitation and with no benefit to the community. When the plants came in, they were sold to the Navajo leaders, not sold literally, but I mean, they gave a compelling argument to the Navajo leaders for them to accept them, because they said, you'll get job creation for this area, but yet many of the jobs didn't go to the folks who live there, because the plants came with the employees already recruited who weren't from the area. So they're getting the illness, they're getting the death, they're getting they're not getting the access to the jobs, they're not getting access to the electricity, but they are getting more morbidity and mortality. So these are the kind of stories that make us really cry out around environmental racism, injustice, and so forth. We also talked about we also did this report on the oil and gas industry called Fumes Across the Fence Line: The Health Impacts of Air Pollution from Oil and Gas Facilities. And so whether it's the fact that these facilities are more likely to be located in communities of color and low-income communities, and then we combine that with the fact that too often, even if they're to the extent that there are jobs that folks are getting, these are dangerous jobs, as we saw with the BP oil drilling disaster and the 11 people who lost their lives. Unfortunately, those accidents are all too often too frequent. We have again, impacts on communities where people's water supplies are being contaminated, to the extent that one household in the Granger Township in Ohio, they had their water supply so contaminated that a home exploded. And when they tested the water, they found that the explosivity level was 20%. I guess, interestingly enough, that there is a acceptable explosivity rate, which is 1%, so it far exceeded what I think I feel like there shouldn't be an acceptable level of explosivity at all, but that's a whole issue with under-regulation that we talked about on one of the other slides, that the fact that, that folks will lobby to the extent that we can actually have an acceptable explosivity rate in our drinking water lets us know that we are just not on the right path as it relates to the relationship between industry and regulatory bodies that are supposed to be protecting us. So then we start to see the intersections as well. These top two pictures were sent by someone who they came to our one of our cold-blooded trainings, and they said that they lived 2 miles away from a coal-fired power plant, and they talk about how they have this consistently bad air quality. And they sent this picture of the medicines for their grandson that he depends on to be able to breathe from day to day. Then they sent the picture of the grandson looking on as the child was playing in the water, and they said that's really symbolic of his life, or not symbolic, it's his actual life. But they say he's also often unable to like go to school like other kids because of poor air quality days, or unable to play like other kids because his lung capacity is compromised by his asthma. And then we know that studies show that on average, property values are at least 15% lower when you're living next to a toxic facility. And 70% of African Americans live in counties in violation of federal air pollution standards. And an African American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. So this is where we see the connections in this kind of photo montage, because if you're having a hard time paying attention in school because lead comes out of those smokestacks, if you're having a hard time going to school in the first place because your air quality is so poor, and then you have a school that is funded by property values, which on average are lower because of the presence of these toxic facilities, then it interferes with your learning on multiple levels. And according to studies, if you're not on grade level by the 3rd grade, you are more likely to enter the school to prison pipeline. So this is where we see these inextricably interconnected issues that we address as social justice issues. And then on top of it all, we had similar to the indigenous community that I showed, where 70% of the people on those lands don't have access to electricity, even though they're hosting the coal-fired power plants. Even though coal-fired power plants are more likely to be in our communities, those very same communities are also more likely to have their electricity turned off. Even if in some community, and they actually find down racial lines that a white family can be just as behind in their payments as an African-American family, and the African-American family is more likely to be shut off. So yet another kind of demonstration of environmental racism. But then also there's the fact that again, this is kind of not only the criminalization of poverty, but actually a death sentence for certain people. We had this one family as an example, but it's just an example of too many circumstances where this woman was dependent on her oxygen machine to breathe, and she got behind on her electricity bills. Her son found out that she was behind, and he actually paid off her bill. But the company didn't catch up with that payment. The system didn't catch up with the payment. And 2 days after he made the payment, in the middle of a heat wave, you see the date on this picture is July the 10th, in the middle of an extreme heat wave in New Jersey, they shut off her electricity. And that was she was tied to an oxygen machine. So she literally paid the price of poverty with her life. And we've seen too many people, when we put out that report, Lights Out in the Cold, we had seen too many stories. One story where someone had their oil and gas cut off, and then they used a space heater, which is one of the #1 causes of home fires. Another where people had their electricity cut off, they used a candle to light their home. Again, a #1 cause of house fires. And these folks, best case scenario, lost their homes, worst case scenario, lost their lives. Another story was a father of 5 who had his electricity shut off, and then he bought a generator because it was cheaper for him to buy the generator than it was for him to pay his electricity bill. But he didn't know, but he was in an area that was a dangerous area. So he brought the generator inside to keep it safe. but he didn't know that that would be a death sentence for his family because of carbon monoxide poisoning. So again, these are the kind of extreme injustices going on while we have companies. The average utility company or coal company makes the CEO makes $9.8 million in compensation every year, while you have people being cut off for not being able to pay a couple of $60 bills. So this is the kind of extreme disparity, extreme injustice that that really makes us say that environmental and climate issues are indeed a civil rights issue. So as we look at the other side of the spectrum in terms of the impacts of climate change, we have sea level rise that is displacing people. We have the shifts in agricultural yields that are affecting communities that are already food insecure. We have the disasters that, you know, we saw 2020 was another year for, besides the disaster of the pandemic, the many other types of disasters, whether it's the wildfires, or the flooding, or the tornadoes, or the hurricanes. And so we see where, and then not only in the United States, but in places like the Horn of Sub-Saharan Africa, where women are having to walk further to gather water because of the scarcity of water is one of the impacts of climate change. And we also, so there's so many examples. And then another impact that we see when we talk about the pipelines, that there is this rise in what they call predator economies around these man camps where they do the oil and gas work out in North Dakota and South Dakota. And there's this proliferation of missing and murdered indigenous women as a result. It's one of those things that isn't really talked about that much, isn't covered much in the news or anything, but if you just start to Google it, really just Google missing and murdered indigenous women and oil pipelines, and you see all of the stories that are there, because it's very much this kind of dirty secret in the United States that these things are happening unabated, really. And, you know, and so, yeah, sexual assault also happening in and with that. And so one of the things that we talk about criminalization, and especially in the context of environmental racism and racial profiling, and in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, these were two stories that were featured in the Associated Press, both of them in the Associated Press. But when it was two white people, it says 2 residents wade through chest-deep floodwaters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. So they were cast as just finding things and you know, surviving and doing what they had to do. But when it was an African-American male, it was a young man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And so then we see, again, criminalization that happens in our communities. And then that happens to fatal effect, where a family was just going back into town to find their family members that they didn't know what had happened to them. And someone called, just like, you know, kind of the whole Starbucking while Black or Airbnb while Black, all the ways that we're just doing regular things that similar to this, folks were just trying to survive and find the survivor family members. People were called, the police was called on them as if they were looters. And so therefore a group of unarmed families were just shot on the Danziger Bridge by the police there. And so racial profiling leads to criminalization, and then it literally becomes a death sentence for the people who are just trying to, again, survive. And so we as the United States are 4% of the global population, yet we are 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, and it's impacting us in the United States, and it's having an extreme impact for people around the world. Central America, places, people where the agriculturalists, where many people are being displaced because they don't have anything to grow because the crops are drying up. So this headline says, Central America's choice, pray for rain or migrate. So we've been doing work with the United Methodist Women at the Holding Institute in Laredo, Texas, where the vast majority of the people who come into the Holding Institute seeking immigrant services are are coming in when they're interviewed and doing the intake. They're coming because they're agriculture workers who don't have anything to grow anymore. And they're just coming to bringing their children just so they can find something to eat, something to do, some livelihood that can actually feed their children and their families. And so when in the US, instead of providing sanctuary for circumstances that we created through our excesses, instead, we treat people as criminals, again, that criminalization, and we put them in cages instead of offering sanctuary from harm. So all of these things are kind of backed up by the moneyed interests. Groups like the billionaire brothers, the Koch brothers, we know one has passed away, but putting money into academia, into media, into the courtrooms, and certainly into Congress and so forth to prop up this system, to maintain the status quo of wealthy in the hands of a few, and therefore really stomping on our democracy. We hope that we're going to see a new day, but this has been the status over the years. We put out this report, Fossil Fuel Foolery, an illustrated primer on the top 10 manipulation tactics of the fossil fuel industry, where we really kind of lay out some of the ways that the fossil fuel industry is using the system to push policies and really suppress our democracy. And so whether it's undermining democracy, but through the voting rights, pushing back on voting rights laws, or pushing forward on voter suppression laws, or it is making it seem like government regulations actually hurt the economy and ratepayers and poor people, or it's touting job creation and jobs that are actually deadly for people to be in. These are the ways, or it's using the very pandemic to weaken. This is 2 environmental policy protections, because that was way back in June, but by the end, many environmental protections have been rolled back by this administration in the name of the pandemic, while the very communities that are more likely to have a compromised lung capacity, which we know COVID-19 directly attacks, then have even less protection than they already have, making them even more vulnerable, and why we see such high rates in Black communities for COVID-19. So as we talk about the transformation, reminding us again about the Jimenez principles of being inclusive, emphasizing bottom-up organizing, letting people speak for themselves, working together in solidarity and mutuality, building just relationships among ourselves, and committing to self-transformation. We talk about a just transition being a vision-led, unifying, and place-based set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And so this just kind of says that in graphics. And so these are just some of the things that people are doing, whether it's in this community that they had their electricity turned off by DTE in terms of their light posts, their street lights. And then they actually went in and then DTE went in after that. This is in Highland Park in Michigan. They went in after that and took away the street poles as well, because they decided they weren't ever going to be able to pay their bills, so they might as well take out the infrastructure. So this community actually did crowdsourcing and fundraising and got their own street poles, and then put solar lights on top of each of those street poles. So now they're back in the light again. So there's groups coming together from all over the country to work together on advancing a new energy economy under this moniker of power without pollution, energy without injustice. So in that lower picture, on the upper picture, we have Walea Johns, who was with Native Renewables, which has been doing a lot of the transformational work on shifting from coal to renewables that on indigenous lands. But she was recently just brought into the Biden-Harris administration. So now she's really doing that at a different level there. Very exciting. So in the bottom picture, we have folks from seconds from the Commonwealth, Eastern Michigan Environmental Action Coalition, Southwest Workers Union in San Antonio, all coming together to work on how do we shift to a better and a new energy economy. So we're working with groups like Grid Alternatives to do solar installations on low-income community homes. Working with Vote Solar and others on doing skills training and job placement for formerly incarcerated persons, because we know the best recidivism is actually having the best kind of counteracting of recidivism is actually having a job. So making sure that we're providing fulsome opportunities for people to be able to thrive in society. And we did this solar installation again with United Methodist Women, a very close and dear partner of ours. So we worked together and to do this installation at the Genesee Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention, where we not only put solar panels on this home, it's transitional housing for the domestic violence survivors, but Grid Alternatives, Sunrun, and others, they got together and they trained the women who are living in the transitional housing in solar installations. And now they're all employed in the solar industry and all living independently because they now are fully employed. So this is fantastic. So the only reason we only have the two males, that's actually the chair of our board and the president and CEO, is because of at that time they were still residents. So we didn't want to, so there's confidentiality issues with showing the women at that time. But it was a great day, and having the women be gainfully employed and living independently since then it's testament to how we do what we want to do. So this is when we first did our first energy justice training, one person stood up and gave us testimony about how her electricity had been turned off for non-payment, and she got it back on, and then it was turned off again, and pretty soon she decided that she needed to, after a while they started to not only impose reconnection fees, but then she had to pay a deposit in order to get it back on. So then it just she was buried deeper and deeper until she just couldn't go on. So she decided, all right, forget it. I'm not going to continue with this. And all the money that she bought, like a cooler to keep her cold things in, and each month, the money that she would have put towards her electricity bill, she amassed, and then one by one, every time she would have enough, she would buy one solar panel. Then a few months later, she would buy another solar panel until she had enough. And then she herself was an electrician, so she got up on her own roof and installed this whole solar array. And so I've been to her house, and it was like one of the only times I've ever been to Phoenix, and it was like in the dead of summer. I've been on the equator multiple times, and I haven't been as hot as I was when I was in Phoenix. Anyway, so so I went to her house, and she turned on her apparatus when we were walking in, and pretty soon the cool breeze was flowing, and it was by her own hand. So it was pretty amazing. So that was a great story. So the work we're doing around food justice, this Leah Penniman, Farming While Black, how one mother is fighting to end racism in the food system. She started by doing her own local food projects, and now she's inspiring others. She has a whole training situation and really being generous with her gifts and her knowledge so that she can really build this Black-led food movement. So this is a video I would have shown you, but I really want to have time for us to have ample time to talk. So then the policies that we want to advance to really uphold this just transition we talked about around energy democracy, economic justice, gender justice, migration, water as a human right, food justice, land rights, disability rights, LGBTQ rights. All of these are kind of critical to have in any kind of policies to really advance a just transition. So this is a model policy from Portland where they have this clean energy policy, and that really is very intentional about making sure that it is not just about clean energy, but about job creation, about leadership of frontline communities, about housing security. All of that was put into this policy, which really kind of uses the economic system to create this clean energy fund that's then governed by the people for the people. So it's a beautiful act. is us in front of Capitol on a better day of the Capitol, but this is a group that folks who are advancing what we call the feminist Green New Deal. And so Indigenous, Latina, African American, all coming together to advance this vision of a feminist Green New Deal. That was back when I had hair. Anyway, so advancing voting rights and voting is critical to that, pushing back on policies that, again, concentrate power with corporations and advances corporatocracy, like the Citizens United, and then really pushing for an inclusive transition, seeds of resistance and resilience. We have this Black labor initiative on just transition, because we recognize that with the fossil fuel industry changing, that people are going to lose their jobs. There's no doubt about that. And we have to make sure that the pension guarantee is there, the health guarantee is there, and that a job guarantee is there. It can't be like, oh, well, these folks were just casualties of this transition. We have to put them front and center so that their needs are met in the new energy economy. So just kind of largely ending there, but I'll just say that the native renewables, this article, Navajo women are bringing sustainable solar power to the Navajo Nation. And that is the great work that's happening as they transition from, as I said before, one of those coal plants has closed, and they were able to use even the money from the COVID situation, the CARES Act, to be able to help to finance, because part of the money from CARES Act was to support the utility system so that people can continue to have electricity. So they actually use some of that to invest in permanent clean energy for the Navajo Nation. So I just want to end, when we talk about letting people speak for themselves, we really want to lift up the importance of narrative, because it's things like job killing regulations and so forth that help folks to be able to advance that agenda, that regulations automatically mean that people lose jobs, and that's bad, without considering that we can have jobs and we can have public health and so forth. So we are always talking about how do we make sure that we are in front of the narrative. This is an African proverb: until lions write their own history, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And in a similar vein, I'm an avid watcher of Saturday Night Live and all late night television that kind of helps to put humor into this grim situation we're dealing with. And so I was watching Saturday Night Live, and they told us a skit that really tells this proverb in a humorous way. So this so it was kind of it was Weekend Update, where they kind of tell news. And so they said, as told in the local newspaper, hunter, thinking deer was dead, was injured as the deer jumped up and gored him. So that was told from more the hunter's perspective. So the headline was "Deer Attacks Hunter." And then they said, or as the story was told in the deer community, serial killer injured as victim fights back. And so that is the power of the reframe, because if we're telling our own story, so you get the idea. So I really want to transition us into having a conversation. So I'm gonna take notes and stop the share so we can see each other a little bit better. Yeah, so kind of first and foremost, I'm sorry I didn't get to see all of the comments as they were coming in, but first and foremost, I just want to open the floor for like any questions or comments, and kind of keeping them short because we only have 16 minutes left. We want to leave one for an announcement about the next session. So I see Diane.
Yes, hi. I would highly recommend a book that I read several years ago called Strangers in Their Own Land. And if nobody has read that, it's very emotionally hard to read, but it's about it down in Louisiana, how the big companies came into the areas of the poor and built their big companies and have polluted the area, and and why the people there that lived there had no way of fighting or even arguing, or they just had to accept what was coming on because they had no way. They didn't know how to do anything. But anyway, I would highly recommend it. It's very emotionally draining. I could only read about a chapter at a time, but it's very good, well written, and very good to know.
And it's strangers in their own land.
Yes.
Okay. Great. I've written that on the slide, and we'll make sure everybody gets that along with the chat. So thank you so much. I appreciate that. Other questions, comments, reflections, recommendations? Yes, Stephanie.
My name is Stephanie. I'm curious to know how you got into this kind of work.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, so I started off doing special education, actually. So I was working in my kind of first, well, yeah, so I started off doing special education. And when I went into Peace Corps in Jamaica doing special ed, I was struck by how the system even there, and also the global system and the relationship with global South nations was impacting kind of life and well-being. I was really struck by the extreme disparity between people of wealth and people in extreme grinding poverty there, when there was so much in the way of kind of extravagance in the tourist areas, but that was only going to a wealthy few. So that was during the time that I really started to question kind of the development paradigm and everything of that sort. So kind of while I was there, I actually ended up volunteering, in addition to my special education work, I ended up volunteering for an organization that was in a community where their oil supply was contaminated by Shell oil. So similar to the story that Diane was talking about, it was a total David and Goliath situation where the Shell company, Shell oil contaminated the water of this community, and they just were so powerless to really get true justice in that situation, and the laws there just didn't come. So they just really didn't get any kind of compensation for being sickened by stuff from the Shell oil plant getting into their water supply. So that was my first real introduction. I started to kind of volunteer with that organization. And then fast forward, I did women's rights work, and while doing the women's rights work and internationally, I saw we were working on the issue of climate change and how it disproportionately impacts women. And then I noticed that there wasn't really a gender or racial justice analysis at that time to what was happening in terms of climate change in the United States. And so I started to kind of ask some questions, and I reached out to the NAACP, and they had just gotten a grant on climate change, to do work on climate change at that time. And I reached out to them, not in the context of wanting to work with them, but because I was doing this research project on those impacts. And then they asked me if I wanted to consider being the climate justice director, to which I was like, no, I don't want to work on climate change every day, all day. But then I said, all right, well, I'll do it for a year. And that was in 2009. And so the rest is history, because it just became clear that, I was new to it myself. So it was clear over time that climate change isn't just climate change, it's everything. So as you saw from the presentation. And so I was able to really build a portfolio that focuses on everything from gender justice to job creation to water equity to food justice, because it's all inextricably interconnected. So thank you for asking, Stephanie.
This elephant to me looks like it's huge. It's kind of, all the piece parts are assembled in your presentation. Where would I start with the first bite?
Where would you start with the first what? Sorry.
This elephant is so big to eat.
Oh, yes.
It's huge. Yeah. And so where do I, this little guy, start?
Okay, yes. Yeah, I'm just talking about your question so I can make sure. All right, so that's actually one of the questions that was going to come up later in terms of kind of brainstorming around this. So let me show you a paper that I put together actually for Earth Day a couple of years ago that that really starts to answer that question. Like, if you want to do something about this, what are some things you can do? So let me do screen share, and here we go. So basically, I did this 20 things we can do to advance a just and a sustainable planet. And so again, I will share the link with you. But I was talking about ways that we can, easy ways, simple ways and bigger ways that we can really get involved, because as we said, it's a big apple or whatever analogies you want to use. But because it is so big, there is so much that any individual can do. So one of the things I talk about is, getting the word out, hosting community dialogues, whether it's hosting a film screening. We actually have a list of different films that one can show. We gave that one example of Beasts of the Southern Wild, hosting a church discussion. And we link to Interfaith Power and Light that has so many examples of ways, of material for hosting a church discussion, hosting a town hall meeting, so something a little bit bigger in your community to really talk about these issues, writing a letter to an editor. Anybody can do that, sitting in their, wherever they're sitting, writing a letter. So we linked to a place where there's sample op-ed letters and so forth. And then building community cohesion. Some of these things, have varying abilities to be done in COVID, but we give an example of the NAACP and Sierra Club, which collaborated on a healing hike that we did in Colorado Springs, doing a community cleanup, starting a community emergency response team. We're doing a lot around getting folks trained in emergency management, given the proliferation of this. Getting out the vote, and we have, so we have a link to the things you can learn about getting out the vote. So bigger things like running for office, and really bringing these environmental and climate justice lens to that work, advancing a clean air ordinance or resolution in your locality. And we have information on how you can do that. Testifying at the Public Utilities Commission hearings or the public service hearings. That's something that we really need a lot more of. Some people don't even know those things exist. And then therefore we have these utility companies that pay these lawyers to go in, and they're the only ones testifying, so they get what they want, because the community doesn't even know they're there to go there and say, no, we don't want them to do this. We want them to do that. And so them as the governance body are the ones that we should be talking to if we want more clean energy offerings from our utility companies, et cetera. Integrating equity into your local climate action planning. So we have a guide that we put out on how to integrate equity into climate action plans or emergency management plans. So these are just, starting a green school, launching a community-owned solar co-op, starting a local garden, starting an eco district. These are just a few examples of things, and we have links to everything to kind of teach you exactly how to do each and every one of these things. So those are just a few examples of where one could start.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Melody here. My question is very similar to Joseph's. And how do we amplify the voices of the people who are affected? And how do we expose the what the companies are doing?
Yes, thank you. So amplify the voices of those who are most affected a couple of ways. One is, and again, everybody lives in different places, so don't know what's necessarily available to different people. But in some cases, if you're joining an environmental justice group that might be in the area, or some, if there's an NAACP branch in your area, joining, and if there isn't already an environmental and climate justice committee, helping to get one kicked off, and then helping people to know what they, to begin to ask the questions to get people to actually, advance their voice and their leadership. And then exposing what the companies are doing. That's another good question. One is really one of the things we're working on is working with youth to start kind of investigative efforts. So we have youth in one place who are counting the trucks that go by to take waste to the landfill and that are contaminating their communities in so doing. And they also have kind of air quality monitors to monitor the air quality. They're noting who owns the trucks that are going by. And so then they're putting together a report to say, here is the, here's the data. We have pictures, we've done this tally. Here's the air quality that we're suffering from. as a result. Here's what happens on days when the landfill is closed and those trucks aren't going by in terms of air quality. Here's what's happening when they are going by. And then we teach them how to go and get hospital asthma hospitalization rates. And then they can put all that together into a report and tell their story. So that's an example, you know, as it relates to that. But we also have other kind of tools and guidance on how you can, you know, how you can also kind of expose corporations and companies for what they're doing in your locality. So yes, hopefully.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Enrique, I think, yes.
Just a request. I understand that next week or at some point when everything is compiled, Scott will be sending out the links to all of these presentations.
Yes.
There is a request in the chat, okay, about including also, and that would be for you if you can, before you send it to Scott, including some of the links to the reports that you are referencing about, okay? And I would also suggest that you add this link, this document that you just presented for Joseph, because it has a absolutely phenomenal multiplicity of links to action.
Yes.
So send those two additions to Scott, please.
Yes, will do. Thank you. So I know folks only have 3 minutes to get over to the next session, and yes, Cassidy, is that the right pronunciation, Cassidy? Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Is also going to give us a quick what she put in the chat. She's going to make a quick announcement about. Just want to make sure there isn't one remaining question because we have about 2.5 minutes left, or remaining comment or suggestion.
I do have a question.
Sorry. Yes. Yes.
A group of churches is talking about joining Green Faith. Now, that versus joining the NAACP and getting involved with their environmental group. There's so many organizations out there to join.
There are, yes. So, I mean, Green Faith would be great, and you don't have to. So Green Faith would be great to join, like as a church, to join Green Faith, which is a national organization. When I was talking about joining NAACP, it was in response to Melody's question in terms of like frontline leadership, particularly in our local areas. So if you want, and again, depending on where you live, but like there's 2,200 branches and chapters of the NAACP throughout the country. So it's like then being able to be in a place where you're supporting frontline leadership. But Green Faith is a great place to get information about how your church can take action and you know, get tools around that specifically. Whereas being with the NAACP would be more an answer to Melody's question, like how do I take leadership from frontline communities who are being disproportionately impacted by environmental racism? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it seems that would be what we're trying to do, is listen.
Yeah.
People.
Yes. So,
okay.
Thanks. Yes, great. Thank you. I think, Laura, were you going to say something?
I just put in the chat. I was the one who had asked about the links. And then right there while you were talking, I just went to the NAACP website and went to environmental justice, and fumes across the fences and some other things like that were right there. So it's real easy. Good website, easy to find stuff.
Okay. I'm glad for that. I've stopped looking because I'm always afraid of what I'm going to see. So it used to not be so great. So it was cringeworthy. But anyway, so I'll hand it back to Cassidy. But thank you all. It was really a joy to be with you all. And please stay in touch. When you get my slides, you'll have my contact information. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, first, thank you, Jackie, for an awesome presentation. That was awesome. But my announcement is more or less that you all will have received a link in an email during this presentation to go to the next ending presentation. So you can either find that in your email or you can click on the link that I just put in the chat to get there, but you'll have to leave to go there. So, you have any questions, just let me know.
Thank you all once again. I'll save the chat, make sure any questions I'll follow up, but you'll have my contact information. I'll just put in the chat really quickly, my email address in case there's any questions before you get the full presentation. And there it is. Oops, no,